Hi, today is Friday, 16th of March 2007. My name is Andres Baez, and we will be interviewing today Lawrence Davenport for the senior design class.
I'm Nick Thompson. Hi.
And I'm Larry Davenport. I guess I'm the interviewee today. So.
All right. I'd like to start with a pretty simple question here. What was your first encounter with a computer?
First encounter with a computer was in 1965, working with a company in Fort Smith by the name of Norge Corporation, who became Whirlpool. And that was in what was called the 1400 series days. So that was before the 3090s, before the 360s. It was the first basically commercial computer systems that IBM had.
What was it about this first experience that really captured your interest in computing?
Oh wow! Of course, obviously, just the technology in itself was so new. That was pretty exciting. The fact that we were very, very much in depth and involved in partnerships. That's an overused word, I know today, but usually those of us that was with IBM or whoever else you were working with at the time were almost indistinguishable between you and the customer you're working with, because you were working so closely day and night to make these new computers that not many people had at the time work, that it was really exciting time both from a customer point of view and from a technology point of view. It also took a lot of creativity then, because you didn't have much in the way of computer resource to work with. You know, the original computer I installed had 4K of main memory, and you were writing in basically an assembler language level, so you had to be very creative to get the jobs done. And so it was a very fun and very challenging time.
What kind of hardware did you deal with at Norge?
It was called a 1401 was what it was called. It was I don't know how to describe it any other way. It was early versions of generally available commercial computer systems. When that system came out, it was the first time that you really could go to almost any customer and talk to them about automating their processes. Before that, we worked on things called accounting machines, which everything was punch cards, and you had boards that you put wires in to make processes occur. And I did that for a year or so before they came out. But in the early 60s, maybe I don't think in the late 50s, early 60s is when the real general purpose computing started.
But what other types of computers existed around that time, and what were they used for?
You had a few specialized for scientific, but generally there was not at that point in time much competition for anything from anybody other than IBM. They were the first general purpose one that was out there, and a lot of people came along after that time in the next 5-6 years or so. But most of the applications we started with were basic general business kinds of applications: accounts receivable, accounts payable, payroll, general ledger. And there was some starting in to work in the plants to do some work for very, very, very unsophisticated versions of shop floor control, no devices attaching to the computer, all manually brought back in. So it all, primarily everything you did was on the finance side of the house, not on the production side.
How expensive were these machines?
Oh, gee, I have to remember. I really don't. The only number that seems to come to mind now is it seems like that if you wanted to get an additional 4K, not meg, 4,000 positions of memory for your computer, it was about $300 a month rent.
Wow.
How big were these machines?
Physically? Well, if you took the computer and at that time the card reader and the disk drive, it would more than fill this room. And on those early ones, the disk drives, the platters in the disk drive were about this big around. So they were big. And I remember one that I worked on at Daisy Air Rifle in Rogers. It had 10 of these platters on them, but it only had one read-write arm. So it would read, the arm would come out, it would go down, go in to read another one. So relative to card speed, it was fast. Relative to anything you're thinking of today, it was agonizingly slow. So.
How did these machines help for the business? Where did they actually automate and maybe facilitate in a good manner of the daily work?
I don't know that there is a significant difference in how they help companies then than they are now. The difference being was the kinds of applications you could look at. I mean, if for example, you took a Norge, Borg Warner, Whirlpool plant, just the process of trying to pay those people and pay them, say, on a weekly payroll was very, very burdensome if you're trying to do it manually. And then even then we had things like Social Security and things you had to report to government. So all the reporting, the gathering of data was very burdensome. So it was the same kind of payback. In some cases you were doing trade-offs against labor, but same as we do now. And more importantly, it was trying to find information just to manage your business differently. But because of the devices we had available, in most cases, with the exception of there was some work, even at that time there were work going on in the airlines for their kind of systems. Most cases, you were primarily focusing on the financial applications and talking about doing things in the operating side of the business, and you would do some of that, but nothing that you would look at today as being sophisticated, because we had no devices we could put in the plants to gather data and bring it back into the system. Anything you brought back in, someone put on a piece of paper, they punched it into a card and put it into the system. So.
How are computers viewed socially?
How were they viewed socially? There was more mystique to computers then than there is now. I mean, we laughingly talk about people now being geeks that work on computers, but people that worked on them then were really considered very, very technical people, and because there weren't, if for no other reason, there just weren't that many people doing it because there weren't that many of them going in. So it was the whole same kind of thing. You laugh about they had their own language they talked. I think it was not something that people feared from a job point of view. They feared computers more from a knowledge and not understanding point of view. I mean, you know, nobody had any computers at home, so it was not something that was common. There was no internet. In fact, at that time, there was really almost no communications between computers. It was a computer ran in a computer room on a standalone floor, and you brought the data into it, you processed it, and then you hand carried the data out. So it was a mystique and a little bit of fear of what they didn't know, but I think they were in high regard, and the people that worked on them were in high regard. All of us at that time all wore suits to work every day. You didn't go to work on a computer without your tie on. Everybody, the computer operators that ran it during the night, most cases had their coat and tie on. It was a much more formal environment. But then companies were generally much more formal then than they are now.
What was your one-on-one touch with the computer? Were you one of these persons that you're describing that were really technical and worked on the computers? Or?
In the early days, in the 60s, it was quite common for IBM and the IBMers to be working with a customer and to do most of the programming for the customer. So they would do work, but we actually were in there doing hands-on, developing systems, writing the code, testing the code. We didn't run it for them. I mean, they had their own computer operators to do the work, but we did a lot of, quote, the application setups and build. So it was more than just a sales environment. IBM at that time was divided into two kinds of people that called on a customer: the salesman and one that was called the systems engineer. You'd almost think of today, we talk about those kind of people, and they're kind of pre-sales. They go in and help with the technical understanding. The systems engineer at that time went in, helped with the sale, but then in most cases lived with the customer day in and day out for as long as they had the IBM equipment until things changed in the late 60s. So it was a very hands-on, very intimate involvement with the systems.
Were there many generalized applications at this point, or did you really have to go in and create applications specifically for every customer?
There were very few applications you could go in and, quote, buy and take into the customer. The customer bought a computer and you sat down and started designing and writing. I mean, I don't remember the date, it was sometime in the late 60s, I installed a computer at First National Bank in Fort Smith, the first one they had, and there was some things we used to call Type 3 programs where some systems engineer at IBM had written an application to do a function, and he just put it in a library, and we could go get that like no charge, take it in, and we'd use that as a starting point to write applications to customize for a customer. At that time, there was no software that I'm aware of that was, quote, for sale. You either got somebody else's, plagiarized it legally, and then went ahead and customized it to that customer's needs and went from there. It wasn't until late 60s and early 70s when the System 360 really came to fore that there started to be IBM and particularly other companies that were writing more general purpose systems that you could buy and put on your systems. And that probably got much more popular in the 80s. That was not a huge business even in the 70s, but it really started coming on board in the 80s.
How often did you move jobs and why?
In the earlier days, like I went to work for IBM in 1965, and my first move was in late 1971. So that I'd been there 6 years, and I moved to New York to work in the IBM headquarters to help run an education program. So at that time, in IBM, it was thought for you to progress that you had to move. You don't have to move now. So I went from Arkansas to New York to Saudi Arabia, back to Arkansas, Little Rock, and moved up here. And then I left IBM and went to work in up just outside Chicago, then went out just outside of Philadelphia, and then came back here. So some of the moves have been related to moves within a company, and some of the moves have been related to moves between companies. So that's how often did I move? Answer the question, why do you move? In many cases, it was to show professional growth, and it was very standard in the 60s and 70s and 80s at IBM that you would work a field job and then maybe you do what's called a staff job. You go to headquarters, then you go back to the field in a higher level position, and you may go back to headquarters. So you'd go back and forth. So it was quite common in those days for people to move every 2 to 3 years as you progressed through your career within IBM. And most people wanted to do that, at least until they started having families and having particularly families in the high school level. Then outside, of course, it was strictly moving because an opportunity came that looked like a good opportunity for me professionally and personally to move.
And who are the people who influenced you most during your career?
I had, in early days, I had some professors that were influential for me. Then as I went to work for IBM straight out of college. I got there during one of IBM's huge build-ups. So there were different mentors, peers within the IBM company that I thought were particularly talented in one form or other, either in personally working with their customers or technically, and I had those kind. And then you always have some, I shouldn't say always, at least for me, wouldn't say impacted my career because of what he could tell me about how to be a better information system professional, but just how to be a businessman I got from my father.
How much trust with information was put onto the computers, like the accuracy of the results?
Very much. The reason I hesitate on that, more so in the early days, there was more of a feeling if it came out of the computer it must be right than there is now. There's so much more work to validate, cross-validate to make sure that what you're getting is right, because there's so many more places where information is coming into the computer from today. We spent a lot of time building cross-checks and controls to make sure it was right. And because it was all, generally early days, it was in the financial organization. It didn't matter whether it came off of a handheld calculator or a computer. That was the nature of the business we were automating, was to have the checks and balances to make sure it was right. I think today, in general, information coming out of computers is very accurate, but it's not perfect. And that's because there's so many sources feeding systems today, some of which you can control and some of which you cannot.
How did you feel about the evolution of computers from, say, the 60s up to the 80s? How fast the growth that made somewhat your expectations of how it would? And
it was easier in the 60s, 70s, and 80s because the technology was growing, but not at the speed it's growing today. I mean, our product life cycles in the 60s and early 70s were a 3 to 5 year product life cycle. So you had plenty of time to pick up a product, learn it, and exploit the use of it well to do a good job with it. Now, where the technology is changing, PCs, what the technology changes, every 90 days? So I think it's much more difficult now as to how you make your decisions of which products you use, how you're going to use them, and being comfortable that you've made the right decision. So it's harder now than it was 20 years ago.
Do you see any similarity now in the growth of the industry as what happened back then?
Some, but not a lot. Because computers today are so pervasive in everything we do. I mean, you can look around my office and tell. I mean, a lot of the stuff I have on my desk are not just because I like technology. My personal and business life is wrapped up in these things. So I think there's similarity, but I think from an ability to understand what is going on in the marketplace, it's more complex today. Computers are everywhere. They're assumed to be able to be used in almost every business facet. And then, of course, the internet on top of that has created a very difficult environment for us, a positive difficult environment, but a difficult environment because of, one, the spread of information, where it comes from, and the uncontrolled validity of the information that may be coming in and through the internet. The internet was probably, from an information point of view, as big, if not a bigger impact in the invention of the computer itself. Because now everybody has access.
Do you have any particularly positive memories of your career that you'd like to share with us? Or?
I guess a couple. I mean, first off, I'll tell you, my whole time in working in the computer industry has been a positive time. I mean, there's some highs and some lows, but in general, it's been a very exciting and fun time to be there. I enjoyed very much the time that I spent in New York because I was there. I was running an education program, so I was taking customer executives and helping them understand how computers were of value to them and relate to it, and they were all so eager to understand it at that time. This was in 1972 through 1975. That was great fun. I enjoyed when I worked overseas because the environment was totally different. And then I spent three different times as a CIO of companies. So I've worked on both sides of the desk, as we say. I've been the supplier and I've been the customer. Of those times, 2 of the times that I was a CIO were great fun. The other time, it was not fun at all, but that had nothing to do with the job of IT. It had to do with the companies themselves. So, well, yeah, but it's been a great ride.
So did you help in the time you were working for IBM, was it more of a business-like environment or more technical environment, and which one did you enjoy the most?
Well, the answer is yes. I've worked in both sides. I was a systems engineer in the early days, so it was my job to go in and, as we used to laugh and say, to make the salesman's promises come true, because they would be describing what we could do and how we could do it. So I was there with them when they were making those promises, but I had to go in and make those things occur. So that was a pretty technical environment. That was a lot of fun. Then I became a salesman for a few years. Then I went into education. I've been in management. So I kind of spread the whole gamut within the IBM company and outside the IBM company. I can probably take specific events in each one of those functional titles, or whatever you want to call it, and say which was good and which was bad. But if I take each one just generically, being a systems engineer or a salesman or an executive, they've all been great fun. So I mean, I don't know that I can say one was better than the other. It was an evolution in my life cycle, not just within IBM, just my personal growth life cycle. So,
did you have any very bad experiences that maybe made you change your way of thinking at some point? Maybe within the company, maybe within whenever you were a salesman, maybe with working with some other people.
Not, I guess I don't quite know how to answer that. I don't know, not as it relates to computers and their use per se. I had some experiences that were pretty good and then some that were not good. that had to do with how you run companies. When I came back in 2003, I moved back here. I taught over in the business school for a semester in a course, and one of the things that I used to talk about to the students was a company that I worked for where the chairman and founder was still with the company, and he used the company as his own personal piggy bank. That was no fun. I mean, everything was done for his benefit, not for the company's benefit. We had a hard time doing things, so that was I learned a lot about how you don't do things, and both from a people point of view, but that was not any fun. It was the same title job as the one I'd had previously at a different company, so it had nothing to do with the function of the job or what I was trying to accomplish. It had to do with the culture of the company and how the executives were trying to run it. I've worked for some companies where they are as ethical as they can possibly be, and it's great fun. I've had one company where at least some very senior level people turned out not to be very ethical, and I couldn't get out of that company quick enough, and they couldn't get me out of it quick enough. I mean, I was a bad fit because I couldn't operate in that environment. So, but nothing that had to do with technology and how you use technology or don't use it. Sometimes a company doesn't move as fast as you'd like, or they're trying to go too fast, or they don't recognize value. But that's just the nature of the job. So me, it had more to do with culture and trying to get things done in a good way and who you work with.
How would you describe the image that IBM had as a company from anywhere from the beginning of your work in IBM until somewhere in the 80s? I know that back then we could probably compare it now as IBM was the Microsoft of back then, and some people liked it and some people didn't like it.
It depends. Yes. If I go back even a little further than what you said, go back past the 80s, IBM's gone through a lot of different phases through these last 40, 50 years. In the 60s and 70s, it was odd, in the 50s and 60s, I didn't work in the 50s, but in those days, IBM sold you something, you only leased it, and there was never ever a price increase. So there was never one of these things of going in under those kind of environments and having to work in a bad mode. So IBM was well thought of, had a lot of good, talented people, all dedicated to it. It was a great, great time. Then as the 80s started rolling around, I think IBM itself stumbled, did some things not so well. I mean, we all laugh, but for example, there's no reason today that Microsoft should even be in business. IBM gave that one away because we were so driven by the mainframe. Nobody believed in the PCs, and they let Bill Gates take it and run with it. And that some people won't agree with that, but that's absolutely fact. IBM should have owned that marketplace and stumbled. And all during that late 80s, there was a lot of that going on. IBM was too bureaucratic. It had a hard time making decisions, and sometimes the customer relationships suffered from that. So we went through a time where you went from being a great partner to people almost thought of you as another company. Then Lou Gerstner came in the 90s as a chairman, a guy that was from outside of IBM. Probably one of the smartest moves that the company ever made, bring somebody outside to try, and he changed the company. He changed it from being a pure hardware company to a consulting services-oriented company. And as that started happening, then I think the people really started recognizing that this big boat had made a turn, and it was a good company to work with. But the industry is so large that there's not ever going to be a company, at least, except for maybe Microsoft, that will dominate any part of it. I mean, IBM owns the mainframe business because nobody else really manufactures them, and the value of mainframes, depending on who you talk to, comes and goes. But right now, it's a pretty strong marketplace. But the rest of it, the software, the services, there's so much competition that nobody dominates it. But even through all that whole time frame, I don't think anybody ever questioned whether IBM was an ethical company. I mean, have there been some unethical things that occurred? Sure, when you got 350,000 employees, there are going to be some people that do something that's not right. But as a philosophy of a company and a dedication to it, it's a very ethical organization, so people knew that, that we were going to treat them right and do what's right for both sides, if at all possible. And that has held stable, and I think that's why IBM was able to ride through some pretty rocky times in the late 80s and early 90s. But it's not the dominant company that it used to be. I mean, I know I started working as a vendor with Walmart back in the early 80s when Walmart had 300 stores. IBM was the big gorilla and Walmart was the little company. Now IBM's revenues are 90 some odd million, Walmart's well over 200, I mean a billion, Walmart's well over 200, so they passed us. So there's lots of bigger companies, but I think it still is a leader in its technology, its research, and is a company that the customers can count on. Kind of a long drawn out answer, but that's me.
Do you remember any speed bumps along the way that jeopardized the future of the computer industry, just in general? When you mentioned IBM sort of stumbling for the PC market.
Well, there's a couple of three speed bumps. One is very early on. Back there was a system IBM introduced called the System 360, which is kind of the platform that the mainframes ride on today. That was an IBM, you bet your company. If that product had not been successful, IBM probably would not be here today. It was a dramatic change where they went from a series of several computers that were built for different functions. We had some scientific computers, we had some business computers. We came out with a single line, had multiple sizes to support all size customers, all size applications. Huge bet. Had that not worked, IBM would not be here today. So that was a very major time. I think IBM's handling of the whole PC marketplace was a real speed bump. Did not do a good job on that. Then IBM in the 90s, I think, lost some of its focus, got far too much invested in real estate, had far too many people, got too bureaucratic, and people debate this question. I think IBM came close to going under financially. I don't know if the government would have let that happen because we had such a big impact. The same way that, like Chrysler, the government didn't let them go under, but it was close, and that change occurred. Those three events are probably the most significant events that have gone on, at least in the IBM company. And I think in many ways the industry has been in the same spot. If you look at IBM's strategies, while IBM cannot, quote, make anything happen anymore, back in the 360 days, IBM could make a technology decision and the industry went that way. IBM cannot make those kind of things happen anymore, and that's good. But the research that's coming out of IBM is coming out of the technologies that they're sharing and or selling with others that are still driving the whole technology marketplace. I mean, if you look at the whole issue of the hard drives, IBM is still the biggest leader on that, but yet that's put all kinds of people in the marketplace that are now, helping exploit that and move it forward. So IBM plays a big part in that, but there are many, many companies out there. But the big business today is consulting. I mean, and then there's a lot of good companies on that. Lots of good companies. Those are the ones that really help companies that create the visions, create the ways to get somewhere and using this good new resource.
You mentioned something about the government. Was the government a big partner or maybe a customer back then when you were working for IBM?
I don't know that I can speak too well for that. IBM had an organization called the Federal Systems Division early on that did all of the work with the government. And I didn't say they did all the government's work. I said did all of IBM's work with the government. We were a major supplier because at least early on, like every other customer, for a while we were the only real supplier. Then lots of competition came up and we were another player. So I don't know if I would say that the government was a good partner with IBM or not. I assume they were, but I really can't speak too well to that. But IBM as a company during the 80s and 90s was a major player in the United States, a major employer, a major technology deliverer. So that's the reason why I said if we had any likelihood we would have gone under, they probably would help prop us up. It was not because of partnership, it was because of the economic impact on the country.
And about the changes that IBM had as a company, what did you think were big influences for that, for making those changes? So, for example, maybe the consumer was needing something else that they needed, and then there were big changes in IBM to maybe try to help with that need.
I think IBM recognized early on where in the early days of where I started, we used to laugh because back in the 50s, they would, there was somebody did a research project and said, well, there are no more than 50 companies in the United States that can afford a computer, so this marketplace is never going anywhere. And that obviously was wrong. It was right based on the technology as they knew it. It was wrong because technology was not going to stand still. I think IBM in the early 60s recognized that for both us as a company to grow and for the industry to grow, we had to do the standardization of our product set. So that was probably the first time IBM started stepping into recognizing that standardization was going to be what customers and the manufacturers needed to be able to grow this marketplace. So that was an early stepping onto that. But IBM was still very focused upon being proprietary. So we standardized, but we still ran all of our own stuff. And except for a few people who made clone copies of it, it wouldn't work on anybody else's computer. So that lasted for a while. We did not have the vision we needed in the PC marketplace. And that was because the mainframes in IBM delivered so much revenue and profit, they basically directed where the IBM company went, how it invested its money, and they were not supportive of the PC marketplace. So IBM gave that one away. So that was a negative turn. Then as we started going into the 90s, it happened slowly. We started recognizing slowly the standardization again and open systems. And we went from a company of being very proprietary to one that is very supportive of open systems. I mean, we're a big supporter of Linux. Well, that would have never happened in the 80s. We would have pushed it away and said, no, because if someone puts in Linux, they can put it on somebody else. They could take their application that's running on an IBM system and just go buy another computer and put it on that one and work just fine. Push that away because we recognize that software and the services that use them are, one, going to be more profitable, and two, are going to be much bigger in volume. So it was not only to the industry's advantage, it was to IBM's advantage to become very much an open system, open source kind of company. So that's kind of what I see has happened. Without it sounding bad, most corporations do what they think is right for the consumer marketplace for two reasons. One, because if they don't do what's right, they won't sell their products. I mean, there are competitors out there that will do what's right. And two, they do it because that's what's going to drive the top line. Without the top line, you don't have a bottom line to help pay for these changes. So there's not too many companies out there that will just say, I'm going to do this right because that's the right thing to do, and I don't care how it pays for itself. If you do, you won't stay in business. That sounds it has a bad sound to it, but I think it's just, if you think about it, it's the way it has to be for things to work. But as long as we get the right solutions, that's good. And competition will kind of keep people moving in the same line, so we're big believers in competition. We have heavy competition within IBM itself, and always have had. I mean, it's not unusual for two different divisions of IBM be calling on a customer, each one trying to sell their solution set just as if they work for different companies. So we not only compete outside of IBM, we compete within IBM.
Could you give any advice to future generations who might be entering the computer industry now?
Sure. I think to be successful, really successful in the whole information technology area, you need to have a couple of things. And these will sound probably trite to you, but I believe in them. You have to have a very strong business and or engineering background. Not engineering in computers, but just engineering, so that you understand how to work with processes, how to relate to businesses, how to understand business and manufacturing or supply chain processes, because you're going to be relating that to some solution that somebody has already written and trying to find a way to fit it. So you're not going to be writing a lot of code unless you go to work for an IBM lab or a Microsoft lab or that kind of thing. So the vast majority are going to be people who are going to be relating to the customers and people and users of the resource, and nothing better than being able to talk to someone in a very business-like environment. So you need to understand business and or engineering, and best understand both. And the other one that I can't put too much importance on, you really need to work on communication skills. Good communication skills will move people forward very rapidly. Poor communication skills will pull you way back, because if people don't think you can understand what they can't understand what you're saying, or you can't relate to them what you're trying to tell them, or you don't understand how they're saying it, then you won't be very successful. So it has nothing to do with technology, has nothing to do with companies. It has to do with how you personally develop yourself, and then you can work for anybody and be very successful.
How did you think? Well, whenever you were in the education program, what was the vision IBM had towards education back then?
Well, now, this was a very specific education program I was in. I was working on educating customer executives in the transportation industry as to how information technology could relate to their business, how they could use it, and what other companies are doing. So we were trying to take very senior level executives, vice presidents of operations, CEOs, CFOs, and talk to them about solutions that either could exist or could exist in their marketplace, help them understand it so they could put value on them to try to get them to move forward implementing those kinds of solutions. So it was not a general purpose education, it was a very focused education on the use of information technology in their particular industry set.
And you mentioned that IBM was one of the major companies influential in many senses for manufacturing and distribution of computers. How was the international market viewed, or was there any international market within IBM?
Oh, sure. IBM's been in the international marketplace since, well, I mean, I went overseas with IBM in the early to mid 70s, and was at that time, you know, Europe, IBM Europe was a well-developed marketplace. I was actually in the Middle East, which was not so well developed. So it depends on where you were on the globe. But IBM's been in 300 to 350 countries for years, and we almost always had some significant set of manufacturing and research facilities located around the globe. We've always had research facilities in Europe, had research facilities for a long time in the Far East, manufacturing facilities everywhere.
Was the focus on the business overseas different than the focus inside this country?
No, I don't think so. I mean, not as far as, in some cases you had a little bit different kinds of applications, not too much, but it was, generally we're doing the same kinds of things, a lot of times using the same kinds of tools and solutions. It was pretty well the same.
I don't know if you were much involved with the manufacturing side, or maybe you were interested in technology news and how the manufacturing process evolved and the new technologies that came up. Could you give us maybe some...
The manufacturing of computer technology itself, is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
No, I've spent almost no time. I mean, I've been like others. I've made tours of plants, watched it work, we've talked about it, but I have spent little time, and I really can't speak with any credibility on what the advances are and how they've occurred on that.
And how did you keep up with maybe the new technologies or the new trends in technology back then?
Well, back then it was easier than it is now. And I say that because in the 60s, 70s, and probably 80s, IBM expected you to spend at least 10% of your time in formal education, either understanding the technologies or understanding the application of those technologies to different industries. So we spend a lot of time in off-site formal education. Now we spend a lot of time education, you know, on the PC, learning it there, on conference calls. We don't spend that much time on informal training classes where you go somewhere. You have formal training online, but you have to be trained on so much more now. It's much harder. So, but there's always been a heavy investment in in education, heavier in terms of raw dollars, I think, earlier on than it is now.
Do you have any more questions?
I think that's about it.
Okay.
We noticed that you have some relics here of the early days of computing. would you mind give us a small tour, just kind of showing us what you have and
Sure.
a little bit of the history, maybe?
Sure. How well you can move that. On the top shelf up here that is an early version of the IBM personal computer. It was called an XT. That was the first one that had a hard drive in it. Massive storage. It had 10 megabytes of hard drive storage in it. And then they had the little floppy drive on the left you can see. So that is a machine that I'm guessing was probably 1983. I got my first PC I think in 1981, and all it had was 2 diskettes or floppy drives, and that's all it had for storage. And it usually came with like a 64K of programmable memory. Most of my collection has to do with different kinds of laptops. So if you look up here on these top shelves, the one on the far right over here that's an early one that I think IBM and Compaq both had one. Notice that it's 2 little levers. That had no hard drive in it. It was all floppy drives. About the only people that use those is you'd see company auditors carrying those when they were going off-site to audit, and they were like 25, 30 pounds. They were heavy to carry. That's one of the earliest versions of the portable. These other 2 here you see are just a little bit newer and different. Watch you about to get the fan. And then this device right here is a very specialized device. IBM was in a joint development effort with J.B. Hunt, where we, in the early 90s, built what's called an onboard computer, where we actually built a device that would go in the cab of a truck, and it was very ruggedized, and that's an early one where you'd take it out, and it had a Bluetooth-like way to connect so the driver could actually take it out and communicate with it. And it was also an early version of one that used an early piece of Microsoft software to run on it. So I think generally that's most of the stuff that's of interest to you in here. I've got more different generations of laptops over there. I've got most of the different ones. There was one, if I can get it out, IBM had early on that people will remember that was kind of unique. If you can see it when I open it up. So you had a very small machine that had a full-size keyboard, and that was called the butterfly keyboard because it actually came apart, folded up in it. So, like I say, I'm just trying to get different versions of these things, but they all do work. So,
why do you think you don't see that type of design these days?
I don't know. Depending on the customer you talk to about that, some people said it really had a lot of problems, and other people say no, it worked fine. So there was no consistent answer on that. I thought it was a very clever design and kept it very nice and small, but the more moving parts, whether they be keyboards or whatever, are going to give you more mechanical problems, and laptops do get a pretty rough treatment these days. So that's probably what it was, more from availability, not from a concept point of view. Okay.
Well, we appreciate you having us here.
Surely, anytime.
Well, thank you very much. It really is very interesting to talk to somebody who has had a lot of experience in the previous times of computing.
I've been in it a little while. I went to work for IBM in February of 1965. Then I worked for a while and then left for several years and then came back again in late 2003. So it's a fun industry. Fun industry. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.